Here we are, sitting in the waiting room outside our marriage therapist's office, a place my wife picked for us. Every week, we meet here, and today marks our 12th visit. Little does the therapist know, it's also our last. I've arranged a surprise for both my wife and our therapist, a future where they can figure things out without me. My wife can foot the bill. You often hear stories about therapists like this one, but enduring it myself was something I never anticipated. I've nicknamed her the Quack because, well, she seems to have a bias against men. My wife chose her despite my objections, opting for a different path than what I envisioned. Choosing a legitimate therapist together, building trust, and facing our challenges as a team. Instead, Ruth wanted control over the sessions. It's not that I'm against therapy. I just don't see this as therapy. Each complaint from my wife circles back to me with a familiar refrain. David, what you need to understand is that you haven't been providing for your wife. Well, that changes today. Let's rewind a bit and look at how we got to this point. We tied the knot straight out of college 25 years ago. 2 kids later, a boy and a girl, both in college. They're wonderful. Though it's a mystery to me how. I strive to be the best dad, but my wife was often absent. My kids even jokingly called me Dom, Daddy Mom, as I played both roles. I handled school lunches, homework, sports events, and more. My wife's contributions were mostly complaints about her job, me, and constant fatigue. To be fair, she did contribute, but over the years, her focus shifted from the family to dissatisfaction with our life. Job complaints turned into complaints about me, not doing enough, doing it wrong, not having enough money, not planning the perfect vacations. The list went on. As the kids grew older, they often told me, "Dad, you're the best." Hearing that made all the efforts worthwhile. You've probably heard the old story about boiling a frog slowly. Well, I felt like that frog. But finally, I had enough, and I was jumping out of the pot. Most of my adult life has been spent trying to understand what's going on with my wife. Her upbringing was straight out of a horror story. A dysfunctional home, a mother with a penchant for cheating, and a father who, despite being aware, was broken and weak. He was like the mouse that roared, painfully shy, seeking solace in a drink after work, and causing chaos when he got home. The household turned into a battleground, lacking real communication, sharing, or joy. As a child, my wife sought refuge in her bedroom to escape the warfare unfolding in the rest of the house. It's not surprising she turned out the way she did, with deception and manipulation becoming her norm. It took me decades to grasp that she was profoundly broken and incapable of truly living within a marriage. While my love for the kids kept me there until they were grown, I eventually sought therapy for myself. I shared the patterns I observed, delved into Ruth's troubled childhood, and continually asked for guidance on fixing the slow decay of my marriage. The therapist patiently explained she could only help me, teaching me to prioritize self-care, stand up for myself, and avoid being dragged into the empty life that Ruth seemed to be living. I learned to focus on my kids, living for them, all while keeping the door open, hoping Ruth might decide to rejoin the family. As the kids entered college, I sensed the approaching end. My therapist shed light on the impact of growing up in chaos, adjusting to it. Strangely enough, whenever life was good, Ruth would disrupt it, comfortable only in chaos. This realization made me feel less crazy, confirming the pattern I had seen but struggled to believe. Now, with the kids away, our finances stable, and plenty of free time, it seemed inevitable that Ruth would find a way to blow it all up. My thoughts were interrupted by the door to the inner office opening, and another couple walked into the waiting room. The husband had a sorrowful look, and the wife wore a triumphant expression. The therapist earned her fee in that session. Knowing the routine by now, we'd wait for the therapist to jot down her notes on the last session, and then the door would open. "Ruth, I'm ready to see you and David now." That was her way of saying, "I've tidied up the mess, so bring in the next one." Ruth settled on the couch, and the therapist always expected me to sit next to her. But this time I opted for the chair to Ruth's right, facing away from the door. "David, please sit with your wife." I responded, "I'm sorry, but I can see her better from here. Besides, my back is bothering me, and that sofa has never been comfortable for me." "Boy, Was that an understatement? The therapist looked annoyed and said, "David, is there anything you want to say following our last meeting?" "Yes, there is. We keep coming here, supposedly working on our marriage, but I still can't shake the feeling that my wife is cheating on me. I can't move past it, and nothing said here changes my mind." The therapist didn't even wait for my wife to speak. "David, I've told you before that I am absolutely certain that Ruth is not cheating on you. She and I have talked, and I'm convinced that it is all in your mind. You need to drop this and move on." She didn't wait for my response. "Ruth, what do you want to talk about today?" She wasn't subtle with her bias, was she? Ruth scanned the mental list of my shortcomings and settled on, "He doesn't support me." That's all it took, and she was off to the races. "He complains when I work late, and I just want to go out with my friends occasionally to unwind. Blah, blah, blah." Ruth was complaining, and the therapist was nodding her head. It was just like every other session. Knowing Ruth would go on for a while, I allowed my mind to wander. Early in our therapy, in one of our one-on-one sessions, and before I understood that our therapist had an agenda, I told her that I thought my wife had been unfaithful in the past. I had no proof, and it was just a feeling. The therapist shut me down, denied the very idea of it, and told me it was all in my head. 2 months later, my doubts turned to certainty, and her opinion went out the window as I prepared for war. It took some time to get ready, but... David, are you tuned in?" "No?" "Oh, yeah, I heard. I don't provide support. Ruth mentioned you're neglecting her and her needs. You're not there for her when she works late, and you get jealous when she spends time with friends. Well, I keep circling back to that gut feeling that she's not faithful to the marriage." The therapist couldn't even hide her contempt now. "David, be a man. I've told you, she's not cheating on you. Your wife needs a man who can step up and take care of things, but if you keep behaving this way, maybe she should find someone." The therapist just shook her head in disgust. "Ruth, what were you saying? He isn't taking care of the house like he used to. He neglects the lawn when he should mow it. The house needs a new coat of paint, and blah 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 da." I thought to myself, I can name that tune in 3 notes. I must have given away my thoughts. That was careless of me. "David, what are you grinning about? We're trying to do serious work here." "Sorry." And with that rather insincere apology, my mind once again began to wander as my wife continued talking. "Ruth always insists on driving her car to our sessions with the therapist. I'm at work, but I could easily pick her up, and we could go together." "No, that wouldn't work." "Then somehow, she is never available in the afternoons following our sessions." I was slow to catch on, I'll admit, but I finally pulled the cord. I hired a private investigator to tail her, starting with the afternoons after our sessions. Sure enough, after every session, she would meet up with Bill Peterson at the Best Western by the highway. I broadened the surveillance, and it was always every Thursday, but only Thursday. Why weren't they slipping away every chance they got? It soon became clear that this wasn't a new affair. It had been going on for some time. That's when it hit me that she was keeping him at arm's length too. Even with her adulterous boyfriend, she couldn't risk letting him get too close. She was profoundly broken. They had a standing reservation, making it easy for my pie to place a camera and recorder in the room. After seeing that, therapy became a waiting game while I got all my ducks in a row. I now had 3 adversaries to deal with: my wife, Bill, and the therapist. When I was ready, I paid a visit to Bill's wife and handed her copies of everything. She used my lawyer. She wasn't a well woman, which gave me some concern, but my lawyer assured me that with her long-term physical problems, she could clean him out. That seemed like the revenge I was seeking. David, are you tuned in?" "Huh? Oh yeah, I heard. The house needs a new coat of paint." "Yeah. Well?" At that moment, there was a knock on the door. Who the hell is that? The therapist was getting up. "I'll get it. It's for me anyway." "For you?" "David, this is a session. This is sacred time." "What do you mean arranging something outside?" I didn't give her time to finish. I opened the door, and there stood Bill and his lovely, if frail wife Marie. Welcome. Just in time. I'm glad you could make it. Come on in. Bill looked confused. Marie looked like a woman with a purpose. Her hand shook with a neurological weakness as she placed her cane on each step, but she marched into the room with a purposeful stride. Bill clearly did not know who I was. He extended his hand and said, "My wife made this appointment. I honestly don't know exactly why we're here." "Well, let me explain it, Bill." Turning to my right and pointing to my wife on the sofa, I said, "You know my wife Ruth, don't you, Bill?" "I've heard about it, but I've never seen it before." The color actually drained from his face as he turned pale white. I don't. No need to lie, Bill. We're all friends here. Therapy sessions are a safe place. I stole that last line from the first session with the quack. Coincidentally, she chose to speak up at this point. "David, what is going on here? How can you interrupt a session this way?" "Sorry, Miss Jacobs. This is Bill Peterson. He and my wife have been having an affair for almost a year now. And before you tell me it's all in my imagination, I have lots of photographs and videos of the two of them running at the Best Western." Turning to Bill, I said, "Bill, why don't you sit next to Ruth? If you can do that, you can at least sit next to her while we take care of this nasty business." Then, turning to Marie, I kissed her on the cheek and said, "Marie, it's always good to see you. Would you like this chair? It's surprisingly comfortable." With a smile, she sat and stared daggers at her husband. I took the chair opposite her, so the coffee table was between us. Ruth and Bill were on my right, and the quack was on my left, still making guppy faces, mouth opening and closing but no sound coming out. "So isn't this nice? Marie, you're looking lovely as always. How are you feeling today?" "Better than most days, David. Thank you for asking. I think a weight is about to be lifted off my shoulders." I had to smile at that remark. Marie was a woman with real problems and a difficult future. Her optimism and upbeat nature were inspirational. "So Miss Jacobs was telling me earlier that my thoughts of Ruth cheating on me are all in my head." Marie laughed at that. I looked around the room. "Who wants to see the photographs? I brought my tablet if anyone wants to watch one of the movies." Looking at the quack, I say, "How about you? Want to watch this guy plowing my wife in the affair you told me didn't exist?" "No? You're awfully quiet all of a sudden." Turning to Bill, I said, "You know, Bill, being intimate with my wife is one thing, but I've been her husband for a long time. And despite her lies and betrayal, I do still have a sense of responsibility for her well-being. You have a tendency to be rough with her, Bill. You treat her like a brute. Don't you ever just make love to her? Or maybe that's not what she likes now." I looked at Ruth. "Maybe if I knew you wanted to be treated that way, you wouldn't be involved with this coward behind my back." I never would have predicted it, but she was actually sobbing. For the life of me, I couldn't understand it. She obviously knew that our marriage was over. Bill's marriage was over. She could now have Bill all she wanted, or any other man. Why the waterworks? All she was losing was me, and she gave every indication that she didn't want me in the first place. Except maybe she needed me to provide the emotional stability that she could not provide herself. Ruth finally found her voice. "I never meant for you to find out. I'm sorry, David. I never meant to hurt you." And on, working her way down the list of cheaters' cliches. It was so pathetic it was almost amusing. "Cut the waterworks, Ruth. You've had a year to consider your actions." Looking at the pathetic excuse for a man sitting next to her, I said, "And what is your excuse? Your wife has given you 2 children, now grown and on their own. She has special needs, and you repay her by sneaking around? Have you ever considered being a man, facing your responsibilities, and being honest with someone just once in your life?" I could see the anger rising in his face, and I was more than prepared for it if I got the chance. I never did. In the end, the two of them just sat there, offering worthless excuses and empty apologies until there was another knock on the door. "Oops." I looked at Marie. "It looks like our last guest has arrived." Up until this point, the quack has been surprisingly silent. This got a second outburst from her, to which I simply shrugged and opened the door. A middle-aged man in a cheap suit stepped into the office, and I pointed to the sofa. "That's them." He walked over to the 2 cheaters, hands them each a manila envelope and said, "Ruth Harper, Bill Peterson, you have been served." Then he snapped a photograph and turned away. That's all there was to it. I suppose it was the first time he'd served anyone in a marriage therapist's office because he gave me a wicked smile as he passed and quietly left the room. I closed the door behind him and reclaimed my seat. Well, this has been quite a day, hasn't it? I can see by the clock on the wall that our hour is about up. Perhaps Miss Jacobs can spend the last few minutes with the cheaters to help them process what's happened here today. I turned to her and added with more than a little sarcasm in my voice, and maybe you can figure out how you could get it all so horribly wrong. I rose, helped Marie to her feet, and took her arm as we left the office. Walking slowly down the hall, I asked, "Are you going to be okay?" "I think so. When you first showed me the evidence of their betrayal, I was lost. I wondered how the man I married could do that to me. I know now that he isn't the man I married, or the man I thought I married. All I'm losing is a memory, or an illusion of what I thought I had and didn't." It struck me that she was speaking for both of us. She looked at me and said, "I still have my children, and my grandchildren will be along in a few years. I'll be okay. You also have friends. Don't forget that. And maybe in time you might count me among them." She smiled a sad smile, patted me on the arm and said, "I already do. In that case, what would you say to having lunch with a friend?" She smiled the first real smile I'd seen all day and said, "I'd love that." We both drove our own cars to lunch. It began as a somber meal, each of us quietly revisiting the sad events of the day. We knew it was approaching, a planned conclusion to 2 marriages, and the lives we thought we had built together. We discussed the 2 of them for a while, and eventually agreed that it was time to start moving forward. So we shifted our focus to our kids and the happenings in our town. Surprisingly, we found out we had a few mutual friends, and I felt reassured knowing they would support both of us. You know, when all this is over, our friends will likely try setting us up on blind dates with their single friends. The thought gave me a spontaneous shudder. She chuckled quietly and reassured me. "It won't be that bad. Who knows? You might even enjoy it." All I could do was shake my head and sigh. As we talked, optimism grew for both our futures. I eventually returned home without worrying about where the cheaters went or how they got there. Separately or together. They might have gone off to plan their defense or seek lawyers. Or maybe they just headed for their weekly rendezvous. Marie probably gave him a ride, considering they had their car. But of course, it was never that simple. Ruth came home later, and attempted every apology she could think of. She even placed some blame, a common response when a woman cheats, as it's often partly her husband's fault. I wondered if the quack was still coaching her. When she finally ran out of steam and sat there sobbing, I decided it was my turn. I kept it brief and straightforward. "Ruth, throughout our marriage, I pitied you. The home you grew up in was a living hell. I knew you were scarred by that life, but I believed you had escaped relatively unharmed. I thought that by offering you a genuinely loving marriage, you could heal and become the woman you aspired to be. What I failed to grasp is that you can't heal. You are deeply broken. Every time we made progress, when life was good, you'd destroy it. You're incapable of finding happiness. All I've known is sadness and destruction. I can't continue living that way, and I won't live with a liar and a cheat. Ruth, we're done. The kids are grown, and it's time for us to part ways. Let that sink in for a moment. You need help, Ruth. You need genuine therapy, not that quack who validates everything you say and justifies everything you do. When you find that therapist, let them guide the sessions. I know you, and you need to control everything. But you won't reach where you need to be if you control the journey. Find a true professional who can help you navigate a process of self-examination, freeing yourself from the ghosts and demons that haunt you from your youth. Please, promise me you'll seek real help." I doubt she heard my words. Her mind had too many obstacles preventing her from accepting guidance. And the sad truth is that she was too much of a coward to face her demons. I struggled with the decision to divorce Ruth. I kept revisiting my vows, remembering in sickness and in health. There was no doubt that Ruth was unwell. Ultimately, I concluded that sick or not, Ruth knew right from wrong, and betrayal is still betrayal. 3 years had passed since that crucial therapist meeting, and I've moved forward. The divorce was finalized over 2 years ago. We divided our lives, and I was ordered to pay support for 3 years, with less than a year to go. I've learned that when love dies and the anger fades, what remains is a profound sense of sadness and loss. I lost what was, but that was long before the divorce, and I lost what could have been, if I ever had that to begin with. Yet, in life, you don't dwell on what's lost. I moved across town, kept my friends who became my best therapy, and rebuilt my life, emphasizing things I had always enjoyed but surrendered because my wife wanted other things. In the process, I met a wonderful woman who shares my interests. We've both been hurt before and we're taking it slow. I'm optimistic, but I'm not in a hurry. As for Bill, well, he got a pass. I wasn't going to end up behind bars just for a bit of revenge. More importantly, Marie needed him to be working so we could support her. I believe he faced the consequences he deserved. The whole unfortunate experience has taught me a crucial lesson. I've discovered that we can rebuild a good or even better life by remembering who we are, keeping our eyes on the future, and seizing the opportunities life presents. As for my ex, I doubt she'll ever find happiness. It's just not in her nature to embrace the joy life offers and truly live it. She'll always be searching for something more, losing what's most important in the process, and, all the while, refusing to invest a part of herself in the lives around her. I feel sadness for her, but now I understand that I cannot change who or what she is, and all I can do is move forward,